The studio lights were already burning hot when Dean Martin stepped through the narrow hallway behind the stage. The low hum of a live audience vibrating through the walls like a distant ocean. It was the early 1960s, and the broadcast was scheduled to reach millions of living rooms across America that night. Stagehands rushed past him with headsets and clipboards. Musicians adjusted their instruments in the orchestra pit and somewhere beyond the curtains. The audience was laughing at a warm-up joke they would never remember. Dean moved calmly through it all, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. His tie perfectly straight, his expression relaxed in a way that made people think nothing ever touched him. That illusion followed him everywhere. To the world, he was effortless charm, endless confidence, the man who never seemed to feel the weight of anything. But behind that easy smile lived a man who had learned many years ago how sharp, quiet moments could be. Dean paused near a mirror at the end of the hall, briefly studying his reflection. He didn't do it out of vanity. It was a habit left over from his early club days, when nervousness used to twist in his stomach before every performance. He adjusted his cuffs, rolled his shoulders once, and breathed in slowly. The reflection looking back at him wasn't just a famous entertainer. It was the son of immigrants who once worked odd jobs to help his family survive. It was a former gas station attendant who had been laughed out of auditions. It was a man who knew how easily a careless word could reopen old wounds inside the heart. Tonight's show was supposed to be simple. Music, laughter, lightness. But Dean had lived long enough to know that sometimes the biggest moments arrived disguised as nothing at all, as he turned away from the mirror and continued toward the stage entrance. Two junior staffers stood just ahead, unaware he was behind them. One of them, a young man in a pressed blazer with a headset slung loosely around his neck, glanced at a clipboard and snorted quietly. "They're really still pushing the crooner thing with him?" He murmured to the other, keeping his voice low, but not low enough. "I mean, he's charming, sure, but it's the same old act. Smile, sing, pour a drink, move on. Kinda makes you wonder how much of it is real." The second staffer shrugged. "That's television. People don't want depth. They want comfort." The first one smirked faintly. "Yeah, a comfortable illusion." They both laughed softly, the kind of casual, careless sound people make when they think they're invisible. Dean stopped. The hallway seemed to narrow around him. The distant orchestra suddenly muted by the simple weight of the words, "a comfortable illusion." He had heard harsher things in his life-direct insults headlines, public criticisms, but there was something about the quietness of this one that cut deeper. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't meant to wound. It was said the way people say things they believe are simply true. For a moment, he stood still, letting the sentence settle. He didn't feel anger rise the way he might have years before. What he felt instead was something heavier, slower, a familiar echo of being underestimated, reduced, flattened into an image. Neither of the young men noticed him. They turned the corner, their laughter fading, leaving Dean alone in the narrow corridor with the echo of his own breathing and the low murmur of the crowd beyond the curtain. He could have cleared his throat. He could have said something sharp, something clever. He was famous for that. The audience loved it when Dean Martin put someone in their place with a smile. But he didn't. He remained still, eyes lowered briefly, fingers brushing the smooth fabric of his jacket. In that quiet space, he felt the memory of his father's hands, rough from factory work. He remembered standing in smoky clubs, singing to half-empty rooms where no one cared who he was. He remembered being told he was replaceable, forgettable, safe, and in that remembering, something inside him softened instead of hardened. A stage manager appeared at the end of the hall, scanning the area. "Dean, we're ready for you in 90 seconds, she said. He nodded, offering her a polite smile, and resumed walking. With every step, the quiet insult followed him not as an accusation, but as a question. Was he only what people saw? A polished surface? A familiar shape that asked nothing of anyone? The curtain loomed ahead, tall and red, shimmering slightly as stage lights shifted behind it. The applause rose and fell in waves. Somewhere out there were people who had waited all week to watch him sing. People who were tired. People who were lonely. People who needed something they didn't yet have words for. And suddenly Dean knew that tonight, without planning it, without announcing it, he was going to give them more than a song. He reached the edge of the stage and took his place just out of sight, the heavy curtain inches from his shoulder. The orchestra began the soft opening notes of the number he was scheduled to perform, a gentle, familiar melody that audiences loved because it never surprised them. Dean closed his eyes briefly. He felt the wood of the stage beneath his shoes. He felt the low vibration of the bass through his chest, and he felt a calm certainty settle into him. The young staffer's words had not diminished him. They had opened something, an opportunity, not to defend himself, but to reveal himself. The announcer's voice rang out, warm and bright, introducing him to roaring applause. The crowd clapped, cheered, some even stood. The curtain began to part. Light spilled across his face, brilliant and blinding, and as Dean Martin stepped forward into the glow, the familiar smile touched his lips. But behind it lived a decision. Tonight, he would not perform an illusion. Tonight, he would offer the truth wrapped gently in melody. Tonight, he would answer a quiet insult with a moment so sincere, so unexpected, that no one in that room would forget how powerful kindness, vulnerability, and dignity could be when placed under a spotlight. And somewhere, deep in the audience, a story was about to begin. The applause rolled through the studio like distant thunder, steady and warm. It's the kind of sound Dean Martin had stepped into thousands of times before. But tonight, as he walked toward the microphone at center stage, something in the air felt different. The orchestra was already prepared for the scheduled tune, the one written neatly on every program placed on every seat, the one rehearsed earlier that afternoon with polished ease. The bandleader lifted his baton, ready to cue the familiar opening. Dean lifted his hand gently instead. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, just a small, almost casual motion, but it was enough to make the baton pause midair. A faint ripple of confusion passed across the musicians. The cameras continued to roll. Millions were watching. And for the first time that night, nothing was happening. Dean stood at the microphone, the bright studio lights turning the audience beyond into a soft, faceless glow. For a moment, he said nothing. He let the quiet stretch just long enough to become noticeable. The kind of silence that makes people lean forward without realizing it. The kind that unsettles producers behind glass and makes cameramen glance at one another. Somewhere in the wings, a director mouthed, "What's he doing?" But Dean wasn't thinking about timing anymore. He wasn't thinking about programming. He was thinking about the narrow hallway, about the word illusion, about how many people spent their lives being seen only for the surface. They offered the world. He cleared his throat softly and smiled, but there was something different in it now. Less performance, more presence. "You know," he began, his voice warm but quieter than usual. "Sometimes a fellow spends his whole life singing songs people already know, and there's nothing wrong with that. Familiar songs can feel like home." A gentle murmur moved through the audience. This wasn't part of the script, but every once in a while he continued. Resting one hand lightly on the microphone stand, you come across a song that isn't written on any page. A song that lives somewhere deeper. And tonight, I'd like to try something a little different, if you'll let me. In the control room, producers shifted in their seats. The bandleader lowered his baton slowly. Dean turned his head slightly toward the orchestra. "Give me something simple," he said. "Real simple." The pianist touched a few tentative notes, soft and searching. A bass joined in, gentle as a heartbeat. No full arrangement. No flourish. Just a musical space. Dean closed his eyes, and when he began to sing, it wasn't the voice the audience expected. It was still smooth, still controlled, but it carried something heavier, something textured by memory. The melody he shaped was slow, almost fragile, and the words he sang were not the clever lines of a popular tune, but the quiet confession of a man speaking to the room as though it were a single person. He sang about nights when applause felt far away, about standing in kitchens long after midnight with nothing but a cup of coffee and a question that wouldn't leave, about learning that being liked was not the same as being known. Each phrase settled into the studio like falling dust. The audience grew still. Not the polite stillness of attention, but the deep stillness of recognition. Cameras panned across faces that had come expecting light, entertainment, and were now discovering something they hadn't prepared for. A woman in the third row pressed her fingers to her mouth. An older man lowered his head, eyes fixed on the floor. Somewhere near the back, a young usher stood frozen, forgetting the program in her hands. The orchestra followed Dean instead of leading him, shaping itself around the emotion rather than the structure. And in the wings, a junior staffer, the same one from the hallway, had stopped mid-step. He stared at the stage, a faint unease creeping into his expression as the voice he had dismissed as comfortable unfolded into something unmistakably real. Dean opened his eyes halfway through the song, and when he did, he didn't look into the cameras. He looked into the audience. He let his gaze drift, unhurried, meeting strangers as though they were old friends. The lyrics spoke of quiet insults that no one hears, but everyone carries. Of rooms people walk out of while leaving pieces of themselves behind. Of the strange courage it takes to remain gentle in a world that often mistakes gentleness for emptiness. It wasn't a dramatic performance. There were no big notes meant to impress. The power lived in restraint. In honesty, as the final chord faded, no one clapped. Not yet. The silence that followed was thicker than the one before. Dean remained still at the microphone, head slightly bowed, hands relaxed at his sides. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if he had misjudged it. If perhaps he had asked too much of a room built for entertainment. If perhaps this was not what people wanted. Then he heard it. A single breath, a soft, unsteady exhale somewhere in the front rows. Then another. Then the slow sound of someone beginning to clap, not loudly, not triumphantly, but the way one might knock on a door, unsure if anyone will answer. The applause spread, not as a roar, but as a rising tide. People stood, not because they were prompted, but because their bodies seemed to need to. The ovation grew until it filled the studio, until it pushed against the walls, until it carried something more than approval. It carried gratitude. Dean nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement, but he did not bow. He did not joke. He simply placed a hand over his heart. Behind the curtain, the hallway that had carried a quiet insult earlier now carried whispers. That wasn't planned. Did you hear that? What was that song? The junior staffer stood near a lighting rig, his earlier smirk long gone. He felt unsettled in a way he couldn't quite name. The performance hadn't shamed him. It hadn't confronted him. It had done something worse. It had made him see as the show moved on. Dean returned backstage, polite as always, exchanging brief words with crew members, accepting nods and soft congratulations. But his attention was elsewhere. He felt the residue of the song still moving through him, like a door left open. And somewhere beneath that, a sense that tonight was not finished with him yet. That the real moment had not happened under the lights, but was waiting quietly, where no one expected it. He found a small dressing room and closed the door gently behind him. The muffled sound of the show continued outside. Dean loosened his tie and sat for a moment, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped. He wasn't tired. He was alert in a way that surprised him, as though something unseen were approaching, as though the hallway conversation had been only the first ripple of a much larger wave. There was a knock, not the confident knock of a producer or the casual tap of a stagehand. This one was hesitant, almost apologetic. Dean looked up at the door, and for reasons he could not explain, he felt a tightening in his chest. "Come in," he said. The door opened slowly, and the person who stood there would change the meaning of the night. The person no one noticed. The door opened only a few inches at first, as though whoever stood on the other side was reconsidering the decision even as they made it. A thin slice of hallway light cut across the dressing room floor, stopping near Dean Martin's shoes. For a moment, neither man spoke. Dean straightened slowly, sensing that this was not a request for an autograph or a production note. There was a weight in the silence that felt personal. "Come in," he said again. Softer this time, the door opened wider. The young man from the hallway stepped inside, up close. He looked different than he had earlier. Without the laughter, without the casual confidence of being unseen, His posture had changed. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his hands held together in front of him as though he were carrying something fragile. The headset was gone. So was the smirk. In its place was an expression Dean recognized instantly, because he had worn it himself many times before. It was the look of someone who had spoken without knowing they were being heard, now could not undo it. "I'm sorry," the young man said quickly, as though afraid he might lose the courage if he paused. "Mr. Martin, I didn't know how to start, but I needed to say something before the night ended." His voice faltered. He swallowed. "I was in the hallway earlier. I said something I shouldn't have. Something small. But then I heard what you did out there." He gestured vaguely toward the stage beyond the walls, "and it didn't feel small anymore." Dean studied him for a long second. He did not interrupt. He did not reassure. He simply listened, the way few famous men ever seemed to. The young man shifted his weight, eyes dropping to the floor. "I thought I knew what you were," he continued. "What you represented. Something easy. Something polished. Something people didn't have to think about. But when you sang just now, it felt like you were standing in a room I've been in my whole life." He let out a breath that shook despite his effort to control it. "I didn't mean to insult you, but I did, and I needed you to know I'm sorry." Dean rose from the chair slowly. He walked not toward the door, but toward the young man, stopping a respectful distance away. "What's your name?" he asked Elliot. The young man replied. "Well, Elliot," Dean said gently. "You didn't come in here to talk about me." Elliot looked up, startled. Dean's gaze was steady, kind, unsettling in its clarity. People don't walk into a stranger's room and carry that much weight unless something else is already heavy. He gestured to the small couch by the wall. "Sit." Elliot hesitated, then obeyed, lowering himself onto the edge of the cushion, as though unsure he was allowed to occupy the space. Dean sat across from him, resting his forearms on his knees. The show's distant applause and music drifted faintly through the walls, but it felt far away now, like another world. "Tell me what you heard," Dean said. Elliot frowned slightly. "What I heard? In the song," Dean replied. "What did it touch?" For a long moment, Elliot said nothing. Then his shoulders slumped, as though something inside him had finally found permission to fall. "My mother used to sing," he said quietly. "Not on stages. Just at home, in the kitchen, when she thought no one was listening. She cleaned offices at night. I'd stay up sometimes, pretending to do homework just to hear her." His voice thinned. "She used to say the hardest part wasn't the work. It was how invisible it made her feel." He laughed faintly, without humor. "She died last year. And tonight, when you sang about leaving pieces of yourself in rooms people walk out of, it felt like she was standing right next to me again. And I realized I'd just turned someone else into what I was always angry the world made her." The words settled between them. Dean leaned back slightly, absorbing them. He felt something open in his chest, slow and aching. "Your mother," he said. "Did anyone ever hear her?" Elliot shook his head. "Not really. Just me." Dean nodded once. "Then she had an audience." He stood and walked to the small counter where a bottle of water sat unopened. He poured 2 glasses, handing one to Elliot. "You know," he said, "most people think public moments are where things happen. The stage, the camera, the crowd. But the real moments almost always happen in rooms like this." He gestured around them, "where nobody's supposed to be watching." Elliot looked up. "Then why did you do it out there?" he asked. "Why not just sing the song they expected?" Dean considered him for a moment. "Because sometimes the quietest things said about us deserve the loudest honesty in response," he replied. "Not to correct them, to outgrow them." Okay. Elliot stared into his glass, the surface trembling slightly. "I don't think I've ever seen someone do that before," he said. "Turn something small into something like that." Dean smiled faintly. "Most people don't notice when it happens. They just feel different afterward and can't quite explain why." There was another knock at the door, firmer this time. A production assistant poked her head in, reminding Dean he was needed back on set shortly for the closing segment. Dean thanked her and asked for a minute. When the door closed again, he looked back at Elliot. "Would you like to stay?" he asked. Elliot blinked. "Stay?" "For the rest of the show," Dean said. "From the side of the stage, not as staff. As a guest, I don't think I'm supposed to," Elliot began. Dean cut him off gently. "Tonight, you're exactly where you're supposed to be." They walked together down the hallway, the same hallway where words had been spoken carelessly less than an hour earlier. But now, the space felt different. Elliot moved more slowly, taking in the framed photographs, the cables along the walls, the distant glow ahead. As they reached the wings, the orchestra's music swelled, and the warm light spilled across the floor again. Dean stopped before the curtain. He turned to Elliot. "There's something I want you to do," he said. Elliot's throat tightened. "What?" "When I go back out there," Dean replied, "I want you to stand where you can see the audience. All of them. And I want you to imagine your mother somewhere in that room. Not invisible. Not small. But heard." He paused. "Because tonight isn't about a response. It's about a reminder." Elliot nodded, unable to speak. Dean placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, then stepped forward toward the stage. And as the curtain began to open, neither of them knew that what was about to happen next would turn a quiet backstage, exchange into a moment that would be remembered long after the applause faded. The moment that changed the room, the curtain slid open slowly, its deep red folds parting like the opening of a secret. Light poured across the stage again, warm and unforgiving, and the applause swelled as Dean Martin stepped back into view. But this time, he did not walk directly to the microphone. He paused near the edge of the stage, just long enough for the clapping to soften, just long enough for the room to lean in. From the wings, Elliot watched, his heart beating louder than the orchestra that now quieted itself in anticipation. Dean lifted one hand, not in greeting, but in request. The applause dwindled into a hush. He did not smile right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same calm that had filled the dressing room. But now it had something else in it, a gravity that pulled every ear toward him. "Earlier tonight," he said, "I sang a song that wasn't on the program." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the crowd, then faded. "I didn't do it because I forgot what I was supposed to sing. I did it because sometimes what's written in front of us isn't what's most needed." He took a step closer to the audience. "We live in a world that teaches us to speak loudly when we want to be heard, and quietly when we don't think our words matter. But the truth is, some of the quietest words carry the heaviest weight." The studio was so still now that even the hum of the lights seemed loud. Dean turned slightly, gesturing not toward the orchestra, but toward the side of the stage. "There's a young man standing over there," he continued. "He works here. You won't find his name in the credits. He isn't on the posters. He isn't part of what you tuned in to see. But tonight, he reminded me of something I think all of us forget." Camera followed the motion of Dean's hand. The spotlight hesitated, then slowly shifted. Elliot felt the light touch him like a physical thing. A murmur moved through the audience as his face appeared on the large studio monitors. He stiffened instinctively, unsure where to put his hands. His first impulse to retreat into the shadows he had lived in most of his life. But Dean's voice anchored him. "He reminded me," Dean said, "that every person we pass carries a room we've never entered, a story we haven't heard, a song we didn't know was being sung." Dean paused, allowing the words to settle. "And sometimes, without meaning to, we speak into those rooms. Sometimes we leave things there, things that stay long after we've walked away." Dean turned fully toward Elliot now, though he remained center stage. "Would you come here?" he asked. The request was gentle, but the moment was enormous. For a second, Elliot did not move. The idea of walking onto that stage, into that light, into the gaze of hundreds in the room and millions beyond the cameras, felt impossible. His chest tightened. His mother's kitchen flickered through his mind. The way she used to stop singing when she realized he was watching, embarrassed by the sound she thought no one cared to hear. Then he remembered Dean's words in the hallway. "Tonight isn't about a response. It's about a reminder." He stepped forward. The distance from the wings to the center of the stage was only a few yards. but it felt like crossing a lifetime. The applause began again, uncertain at first, then growing as people sensed the significance of what they were witnessing. Elliot kept his eyes fixed ahead, afraid that if he looked out, the sea of faces would overwhelm him. Dean met him halfway and placed a steadying hand on his back, guiding him gently toward the microphone. When Elliot reached Dean's side, the clapping softened. Dean did not announce him. He did not explain him. He simply let him stand there, quiet presence beside a man the world believed it already knew. "This is Elliot," Dean said finally. "He came to see me a few minutes ago. Not as a fan, as a person." Dean glanced at him. "Elliot, would you tell them what you told me?" Elliot's mouth went dry. He leaned toward the microphone, then hesitated. Dean remained still beside him, not urging, not filling the silence. The room waited. Elliot drew a slow breath. "My mother cleaned offices," he began, his voice barely more than a thread. "At night, she used to sing when she thought no one could hear her. She said the hardest part of her job wasn't the work. It was feeling invisible." He swallowed. "When Mr. Martin sang earlier, it felt like she was in the room, and I realized how easy it is to make someone invisible without even trying." The words landed without drama, without performance, and somehow that made them devastating. Dean took a small step forward. "There are people watching tonight," he said, "who clean after concerts, who serve before meetings, who stand behind cameras, who open doors, fix lights, sweep floors, hold signs, run cables, care for children, tend hospitals, drive buses, wash dishes, and go home tired without applause. And some of them were told quietly or loudly that what they are is all they will ever be." He looked out over the audience, then back at the camera. "But every single one of them is carrying a song." The orchestra stirred softly, a low, supportive undercurrent. Dean turned back to Elliot. "Would you stay right here?" he asked. Elliot nodded, unable to trust his voice. Dean faced the microphone again. "There's one more song I'd like to share tonight," he said. "Not because it's beautiful, but because it belongs to more people than will ever step onto a stage." He glanced toward the pianist. "Same thing," he said quietly. "Simple." The first notes rose gently. Dean did not close his eyes this time. He sang while looking out at the room. He sang about hands the world never sees but depends on, about voices that don't echo in theaters but steady families and strangers alike, about dignity that doesn't require a spotlight to exist. The melody wrapped around the studio like a slow, careful embrace. Elliot stood beside him, unmoving, tears tracking silently down his face. Not from sadness, but from the strange relief of being witnessed by the time the song ended. Many in the audience were crying openly. Not the theatrical tears of a big moment, but the quiet kind people brush away when something touches a place they had forgotten. When the final note faded, Dean did not wait. He gestured for Elliot to step forward. And when he did, Dean took his hand and lifted it slightly. Not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. "Tonight," Dean said, "the spotlight belongs to every person who has ever been made to feel smaller than their story." He squeezed Elliot's hand once. "And to every person who decides to answer quietness with kindness." The audience rose as one. The standing ovation was not thunderous. It was something deeper, sustained, almost reverent. As the lights dimmed and the broadcast drew to a close, Dean and Elliot stood side by side, not performer and staff, but two men sharing a moment no script could have written. And somewhere, beyond the studio walls, beyond the cameras, beyond the applause, countless people sat in living rooms and kitchens and late-night workplaces, feeling seen in ways they could not yet name, long after the curtain closed, long after the crowd dispersed. The quiet insult from a hallway no longer existed as a wound. It had become a doorway, and through it had walked a reminder powerful enough to change a room.